All right, so now that we just finished announcing our Series A, I thought it'd be interesting to look at how Loft started. So I'm here with Lukas and Fabian, co-founders of Loft, CEO and CTO. Would you two like to introduce yourself? We start with Lukas.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lukas, the CEO at Loft Labs, and on this journey together with Fabian for quite a while at this point. Very excited to announce our Series A, and yeah, excited to talk a little bit about the backstory today.
And I'm Fabian, CTO and co-founder here at Loft Labs, and also excited to be here.
All right, so I guess we'll go back to how did y'all meet before we say anything about Loft? Like, how did y'all meet in the beginning?
We met in college quite a while back. I don't know, Fabian, when was that? 2011, maybe around then?
Yeah, I think probably 2011. Yeah. So yeah, quite a while back.
That's a long time ago. Yeah, 12 years or so. No, 13 at this point. Wow.
Yeah.
Did y'all immediately, start talking about like technology stuff and everything and start working on like an idea for a company, or were y'all just friends like hanging out? Like, how did that all start?
So I mean, back at that time, I was working at SAP, and Lukas had his own company, I think already, like a web agency. And immediately, since we were studying also something with informatics, we were talking about technology, what you can do, especially web technologies, about hosting also a little bit. So we immediately felt like, hey, there is some connection. Eventually, but I think it was a couple of years later, I actually quit working for SAP, and then essentially worked for Lukas in the web agency for a little bit. So that was actually quite funny. We wrote our own framework there for creating web apps, and that was pretty interesting. It was still way before things like React and all these web frameworks came out. So we kind of tried to do our own thing there, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, to be clear, Fabian shut me down initially, though, when I tried to hire him. I think his boss at SAP bumped up his salary when he heard that there may be a competing offer on the table, and it took quite some time to actually convince him to let go of that secure, stable, big company, right, kind of path that he started in college, and then convince him to do something a little bit more scary in the startup world, I guess. But I think you were actually building. I think with another friend of ours, like Matteo, back then you were building like a Reddit kind of competitor, like super early. And I think that was the point where I was like, oh, this guy has an entrepreneurial spirit. Cool. I think I want to work with him.
Yeah, we tried out a couple of ideas. Like this Reddit thing was one of them. I was always into trying things out, and I like technology, so it was interesting times, and also the tech space was still evolving. Like there was a lot of new technologies every year, new programming languages, and then eventually Kubernetes came around the corner, right?
Oh, and you built another cool thing. I almost forgot. You built Sound Detective. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, true. That was before Spotify had this kind of recommend feature. Like I think the weekly playlist, where I built a small tool that essentially recommends you new music based on a couple of things you liked before. So that was also interesting.
Yeah, Sound Detective was really cool. That was, I think that was what got me hooked on. Like, I need to work with this guy, because I was obviously coding a lot, and hours and hours of sitting in front of your computer, obviously having music on all the time, and you just kind of run out of music, right? And then Spotify, as you mentioned, didn't have that recommended playlist feature, and so you listen to all the stuff over and over again, right? And then he built this tool called Sound Detective, where you can essentially put in your preferences, and I think you connect to your Spotify account, and it kind of looked at like what do you like, what are you listening to, and then builds like a continuously growing playlist of new cool stuff. And yeah, that became my default playlist, actually. That was I still listen to that like probably until like about 2 years ago or so. So I used that tool for actually a long time.
Nice.
How'd you get started in containers? Did you start with Docker? Like you came out of like the VM wave, right, of AWS and EC2 and all that, and then Docker hits. And did that really like turn the light bulbs on about what you could do now compared to like what you were doing before with virtual machines and building platforms?
Yeah, definitely played a lot with Docker, and I deployed Docker Swarm, of course, and I always ran a couple of like servers, just renting them out in a data center and playing around with this stuff. And it was pretty fascinating when the first kind of container wave hit. And as Fabian mentioned, I was running this kind of web custom development kind of, consultancy firm, and we did a lot of projects with, obviously containers when containers came up. So suddenly everything we started building with containers, where obviously we're building with Docker Compose locally. And then, Kubernetes came around, and back then it was still like Mesosphere was still like a big thing. And, at one point in time, I was running Kubernetes on top of Mesos on bare metal servers in the data center in Frankfurt, where, I actually drove there and like plugged in physical servers. It's kind of like a part of a research project at the university, and lots of fun stuff. I wouldn't recommend for anyone to do this in production, but that was definitely helpful in terms of like getting my hands dirty with the space. And I think Fabian, for you, it looked probably pretty similar.
Yeah, for me, it took a while, to be honest, to kind of grasp these new concepts, since I was basically just developing my whole time, but had nothing to do with infrastructure and operations. So when Kubernetes came out, there were like a lot of kind of competing tools initially. There were also competing concepts like Mesosphere, for example. And I think there was like a lot of hype and talk about all these technologies, but I felt like initially it was really difficult to kind of know what is actually the difference between something like Mesosphere maybe and Kubernetes. And there was even some sort of like Kubernetes on Mesosphere thing, even though it was kind of competing. So I think it took us, at least for me, it took me a while to essentially wrap my head around like what is actually Kubernetes, what is actually Docker Swarm, what is actually Mesosphere, what is Nomad. So like, yeah, there was like a lot of different technologies, but I'm glad we ended up with Kubernetes. I think this was also a little bit a bet we did. I mean, since we pretty early saw kind of the potential of Kubernetes, we kind of tunnel visioned on that immediately. So I think retrospectively looking, that was a good decision.
What was your first project with Kubernetes, or what was your first project that you would say Loft created, right? Like, what did y'all start with, and then how did you pivot into like vCluster, and like what brought on that idea?
Yeah, I think in my previous company, right? Like finally, Fabian agreed to work with me. There were a couple of other team members, and we did these like custom consulting jobs and custom software development work. And I think we were working for a startup that had raised some venture capital, and they were like pretty tech forward and allowed us to kind of like build on a very cutting edge stack, which maybe they would have been better off with like a container runtime like Fargate today. But like again, it was super early days in this space, and it sounded like the direction that everybody was heading. So we had the pleasure of starting to work with this hands-on for like a real production system. And I think as part of this, and Fabian mentioned this, we were always kind of like looking to build our own kind of tooling and frameworks around things if there wasn't nothing around. And there wasn't really good developer tooling out there for Kubernetes. So we built this tool called DevSpace, and we put it on GitHub, and people explored it on I think I posted a link on Reddit or so, and Michael Hausblas, which is a big developer advocate in the Kubernetes space, I think he was one of the first people to actually pick it up, put it in his newsletter. He was at Red Hat at the time. I think he's at AWS right now. And suddenly a lot of people were interested in this project and like starting it on GitHub. And we've never done open source before, right? Like that was the first, like maybe, like one line commits and like bigger projects, but, not pushing our own project out. But we thought it was a cool idea, and why not, right? And wanted to see what people think. And suddenly there was interest, and that project obviously today is a CNCF sandbox project. Very proud of that story, and I think that kind of marks the start of this whole journey.
So what came first, DevSpace, the idea, or Loft?
Definitely DevSpace.
Okay, so DevSpace while you're still like doing work for other people, and then you kind of like slid that into being Loft.
Yeah, it was really a utility for making our own lives easier, I guess. And since we got these like positive reactions, we are kind of like, I feel like every company that does services always wants to build a product, and every product company is always thinking like, maybe we should do some services, right?
Yeah.
The grass is always greener on the other side. And the same for us. We were doing these custom projects, and we're hustling from one interesting thing to the next one. So we're like, okay, maybe there's a product opportunity here after getting that positive sentiment. And then the idea for before we started calling the company Loft, and before we incorporated Loft in the US and all of that stuff, we first came up with a different name and a different product, and we called it DevSpace Cloud. And that was kind of like a pass. I feel like everybody who is in virtualization, I think Docker has the same story with .cloud, right? Everybody is kind of building that next layer of virtualization, has to build a pass first and fail with it, and then get to what they actually want to do. So pretty similar for us, actually.
So Fabian, where did the idea for vCluster come from? And did it just take you a weekend to create it, like some of the other projects?
Yeah, I think we started out with DevSpace, right? And we built DevSpace Cloud, which was also a little bit like namespace as a service. So what we immediately felt was that DevSpace worked well, but we kind of needed more privileges than just a namespace for users, because there were certain things you wanted to install as well. And especially as we got more into this operator pattern, where we wanted to install CRDs and use them, and actually wanted to build applications that install CRDs, namespace was just not enough. So we thought about like, hey, how do we actually develop DevSpace Cloud? How do we actually develop sufficiently our applications in the cloud? And then obviously, like what everybody is doing, we turned to the cloud and said like, hey, everybody gets a Kubernetes cluster or multiple Kubernetes clusters. And we quickly noticed, this is actually quite expensive, and especially also very inefficient, because these clusters are not actually used most of the time. So they are just idling around because they are waiting until somebody develops with it. And then we thought this cannot be the solution. Like, this is super inefficient. This is super heavyweight and annoying as well. So we thought like, hey, is there maybe a way to give somebody more access in a namespace, and especially let somebody create or deploy operators in the namespace, then it is possible now. And then basically I did some research. I looked at different approaches, how people were doing things. There were a couple of proof of concepts where people were like saying, hey, this might be possible, but we never tried it, and broken repositories. So, it kind of struck me that like there is a possibility that you can just use a virtual control plane. So basically control plane without a kubelet, to essentially kind of mimic the behavior of an actual Kubernetes cluster. And so far there was not really anything working out there. So I thought like, hey, let's just try, see how it goes. And if it doesn't work out, we'll throw it away and try something else. And then, I don't know, I developed this in like the very basic version though in like a week or so. And then I put it together. There were a couple of problems on the way where I thought like, ooh, this might be difficult, but eventually we solved everything. And then when it first basically spun up my first vCluster essentially, which was still part initially of our pass, I was really, this is really cool. This is actually saving us a lot of money. This is actually really helping us to develop our own solution. And I think that was also the moment where I told Lukas and the others essentially, hey, we should probably look closer into this. And that was essentially the starting point of us putting more focus on vCluster and finding out that this is actually a pretty cool solution.
So what challenges did you face, taking vCluster from an idea to a successful open source project?
Yeah, I think with vCluster, it's definitely a lot more challenging than with other projects to just put it on GitHub and, have it be an overnight success, because you first need to kind of understand why that even makes sense, right? So when we had the first couple of conversations about vCluster and we were pointing people to the repository and they heard the term like virtual cluster, the question was like, isn't Kubernetes already kind of virtualized, runs on VMs, launches containers? So why the hell do we need another layer, right? Why do we need another abstraction here? And it took quite some explaining. I think the first year or so, I hopped on pretty much every live stream, and I think Fabian did a couple of them as well. And we really told people like why the architecture makes sense, and we help folks understand that there's really no significant downside, right, to doing this. And I think we were faced with exactly the same kind of concerns when Docker came around in the early days. I think when I remember vividly when I was like looking into Docker the first time, there were a lot of blog posts out there, and there was a lot of criticism, right? There were a lot of folks that were like, oh, this is not as secure as our VMs. This is not production ready, right? And like, there were a lot of folks actually, concerned with containerization. And today the world runs on containers, right? And I think we saw a future where the world runs on virtual clusters instead of real clusters. And it was kind of up to us to not just build the technology, but to also go out and explain why does new architecture make sense and why people can trust us. And, obviously being open source is the first step in creating that trust, because, you can say a lot on a live stream, but people can actually go into the repository, have a look at the code and see how you did it, and then be convinced themselves that, there's no performance overhead once that container is launched, right? And, all these things that sound super unrealistic when you would have, claimed them as a proprietary piece of software. You could just tell them, hey, go in and have a look and see why that makes sense and validate our claims here. And I think that was kind of part of the success, having good tech, but also being able to explain it and going out there and talk about it.
And what year is this too? I think that makes puts it in context. If this is like 2019, 2020, or
that's 2021 actually.
2021. Okay, so that's the very first vCluster launch, 2021.
Yeah, exactly. We had like we had a proprietary version at first, and we were iterating with some pilot customers on this. And I think that was the phase where we were kind of like pivoting from the paths to actually just building the software. And we established the name Loft, right? And baked that into our Loft product, our Loft platform. And then we realized pretty quickly, hey, this actually needs to be separate from the platform. This needs to be its standalone kind of brand, open source project. And in 2021, I think in April 2021 is when we actually went out in the public and pushed out the code on GitHub.
It's a great time to do it too. Everyone's worried about saving money at that point. They've experimented with Kubernetes for like 2 or 3 years and realized this is very expensive. And the solution came in right at the right time. Like it's awesome. So Fabian, like you've done DevSpace a little bit in open source. Did that help teach you how to do vCluster in open source, right? Did you learn some lessons from DevSpace and then moving into vCluster, like that helped out? Like what challenges did you see with open sourcing vCluster?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we learned a lot from the DevSpace launch, also like how to engage with the community, right? With DevSpace, we just put it out there and it basically just lived there for a while without anybody noticing it. But eventually we figured there's certain communities, especially Kubernetes, like there's Slack channels, Reddit, Twitter, Y Combinator, all these different channels that you could use to essentially also present your project, right, to others and tell them, hey, there's something new. Maybe you want to take a look at this. And that really helped us for vCluster. And I feel like, yeah, the vCluster launch, we did a lot better than the DevSpace launch, which you could also see like at how much GitHub stars we got like initially compared to how many we got on DevSpace, for example. And also we knew a little bit better how to engage with the community. We had like a Slack channel immediately where people could write us. So we learned a lot from DevSpace itself. Obviously, there's always some sort of technical challenges when you launch a project. That you basically just cannot test every combination of hardware and clusters. So that always happens. You need to be quick in the beginning to fix some problems. But I think for vCluster, that all went very well. We had quite some buzz in the community. about it. And I think, ultimately this was a very successful launch.
So what is Loft Labs now, and what is the core mission, and what are the products, right, that are important now?
I think one thing that we deeply care about is the target persona that we work with every day. So our user community, as well as obviously folks buying our product, they're essentially the one that we're building all these solutions around, and they're typically they identify kind of as platform engineers. And sometimes they're called the infra team, sometimes they're the platform team, but it's essentially those folks that deal with this kind of massive infrastructure and handing it out to engineers to deploy applications, to run vendor software that they purchased and deploy alongside the applications. And somehow it got to all work together and make sense, and ideally create as much self-service and velocity as possible in that process. So it's not just like a tedious process or a lot of manual work. So for us, it's really important to deliver these, we call them building blocks for these platform builders, because they always build kind of a platform that orchestrates all of these components, right? Software you wrote yourself, then all of this platform stack that is required to monitor it, observe it, track the cost and all of these components, keep it safe, right? But then also kind of independent software you run alongside it, internal tools that got to be spun up and managed. Think of something like a GitLab, for example, that you run as part of your engineering tooling, and all of this is ultimately what I would call the platform that these folks are building internally. And what we are really good at is building these building blocks that can be a part of this platform and make that platform experience so much better. vCluster is obviously a great building block if Kubernetes is part of your platform and you're basing your platform on top of Kubernetes, because you'll find yourself obviously creating hundreds, not sometimes even thousands of clusters. And virtual clusters can help a lot operationalize things and make them faster, cheaper, and just much more lightweight to operate. But we are always looking for what are other concerns these folks have, right? And what are other building blocks we can launch, because we don't have any kind of illusion that we can build this one platform for you and kind of it's going to work for every company, because I don't think that is possible. There's only building blocks that can be possible as part of a bigger solution. And that's probably why we also have quite a few open source projects out there. Some of them are just smaller building blocks. vCluster obviously is a giant building block, but there's more topics to come. And last year, obviously, we launched DevPod as another pretty essential building block for folks that want to hand out dev environments, keep them consistent, run them on any infrastructure. I think there's a lot more work to do in that direction, but we already have ideas for other building blocks in the future. And I think that's how you build like a very vibrant kind of like community, but also a pretty big company, because ultimately in our space it's never just like an insular small kind of space and going too broad and generic and saying, hey, here's my opinionated platform, kind of base everything on this and change all your processes, and this is what we think the golden path should be, right? That may not work either. So I think we found kind of like a good middle ground of how we want to position the company and how what kind of products we want to build.
So you've kind of found success in being software developers who make platform engineers' lives easier, right? Like where you love the platform engineers, you want it to be easier, but you're also empowering developers through it. So all these years later, we've seen over 40 million vClusters. We released vCluster Pro, and more people are using it. You're seeing more talks at KubeCon and stuff like that. What do you see the future of vCluster and Loft? Like what's the future? What's next?
Yeah, so essentially so far, the mission has been to make sure that vCluster becomes a conformant Kubernetes solution. So we spend a lot of time making sure that vCluster is a certified Kubernetes distribution. And we actually accomplished that as the first ever virtual Kubernetes distribution to be fully certified, fully compatible with Kubernetes. So I think for us, this was like one of the first major steps essentially towards becoming this first virtual distribution. And now that we accomplished that, now that we can say, hey, vCluster is really an actual Kubernetes cluster, it can do everything a regular Kubernetes cluster can do, we can go even beyond what a regular Kubernetes cluster is able to do, which is the very exciting next step, essentially. And there's two major things where we see value in the next or in the upcoming time. One of them is essentially snapshotting and restoring a vCluster. So you can basically snapshot a Kubernetes cluster at a certain point of time, and then just move it to a different cloud or spin it up even locally. And it has exactly the same properties, it runs exactly the same workloads as the vCluster was running before. So this is a really cool feature that makes it possible to really move Kubernetes clusters essentially around, which is not possible today, where you can only back up an existing cluster and restore it in the exact same location. But for us, it's not only about restoring it in the exact same location, it's also about cloning clusters, moving them across clouds, across hardware. And I think this is super exciting and something we can solve with vCluster. And then the second big topic that we are tackling is essentially that right now a vCluster is partitioning a bigger host cluster into smaller ones, similar to like a virtual machine is partitioning a host machine into smaller ones. But we can go even beyond that and span multiple Kubernetes clusters with a single vCluster on top, essentially. And that allows you to essentially distribute workloads across clusters, use resources in different host clusters, across regions, across continents, across clouds. So this is super, super exciting. And I think this is really the next step for vCluster as a technology. So we are super hyped about that, that we can now start, after accomplishing to be a certified Kubernetes distribution, this next step of essentially going beyond what Kubernetes right now is able to do.
All right, so we've talked about vCluster. Are there any other projects people should be excited about from Loft?
Yeah, so besides vCluster, we also, like Lukas said before, have DevPod, which is a new technology essentially to basically build a developer environment of a dev container JSON, which is a standard from Microsoft that's also used in GitHub code spaces. And this essentially allows you to create reproducible developer environments. So whenever you heard like it has worked on my machine, but it's not working on your machine, DevPod is the solution, because it essentially spins up the development environment in the same way, so in a reproducible manner on every hardware. And the interesting thing about DevPod is that it's really cloud agnostic and it can run everywhere. It can be on your local machine in a Docker container. It can be in a Kubernetes container in the cloud. It can be even on some SSH remote host that you have somehow access to, or it even spins up a new EC2 instance for you in AWS. And all that is possible through basically the provider concept DevPod has, that allows you to write your own integrations. So we have also a couple of community integrations. We wrote a couple of our own integrations for like the most common and most popular clouds and use cases. But there's already like a growing number of community providers where people actually write integrations on their own for specialized services. And this is super exciting because we really believe that developer environments shouldn't be locked into a certain cloud or a certain hardware or certain configuration, but instead be like used wherever you want it, but it should be still reproducible. So we are also super hyped about what DevPod brings next for developers.
Okay, cool. So with all this buzz and all the excitement around like Series A and everything, I think people are wondering, are we hiring? Where can people go to find out information about Loft and stuff like that?
Yeah, for sure. If you're interested in one of our projects, first and foremost, join our Slack channel. That's where a lot of the community conversations are happening. That's where all of our engineers are. That's where you can, ask questions, and Fabian is going to reply to you if the question is interesting on the tech level, or you're revealing a bug, or you have a great idea. That's a great place to discuss with our team and just be involved in the community. And for anyone that's interested in our company, definitely subscribe to our newsletter. We have a careers page on the website with a couple of open job positions, and obviously as we grow as a company, you'll find a lot more open positions on there. And then just don't be shy and reach out. I know with all the buzz, I have like 400 LinkedIn requests that I got to get to over the next couple of days, and I'm trying to get back to everybody. So bear with me on that front. But just reach out, right? Like don't be shy. We're all open to the chat with everyone. I think that's part of the beauty of like the Kubernetes ecosystem, but also the open source community in general. Everybody's super approachable, and everybody's very excited to exchange notes and ping ideas back and forth. So we'd love to obviously chat with everyone that got excited about what we're doing, from seeing this announcement or from following us over the past couple of years. We'd love to hear from you, and definitely reach out. I hope to see a lot of you on Slack.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming in and telling us about like the origins of Loft. I learned some things too, some stuff I hadn't heard before. Anything else you want to say before we go?
I think we're all good.